I'm not proud of most of the stories I'm about to tell. That's probably the best way to start this. If you're reading this thinking it's going to be some clever crime thriller or some glorified, "Look how smart I was" kind of confession, it's not. It's just me, William, putting something ugly into words because it's been sitting in the back of my mind for years. This particular story started with something I used to tell myself all the time. Money laundering, numbers and accounts have become more important than people. Back then I didn't say it like it was a warning. I said it like it was an excuse. A few years ago I worked in the financial back office of a mid-sized logistics company. Nothing glamorous, spreadsheets, transaction reviews, compliance reports. The kind of job where you stare at screens for 8 hours and the biggest drama of the day is whether someone misfiled an invoice. But the thing about staring at financial systems all day is that you start noticing patterns. Tiny ones. Numbers moving between accounts that shouldn't normally talk to each other. Transfers that technically fit the rules but didn't make much practical sense. Shell vendors that existed only on paper. At first it looked like sloppy accounting. Then I realized something else. Someone, somewhere, was quietly cleaning dirty money through our company's payment network. And the worst part? Nobody seemed to notice. Or maybe they just didn't care. That was the moment the idea first crept in. If money was already flowing through the cracks, what would happen if I made the crack a little wider? I didn't plan to become a criminal that day. Not really. But once you see how the machine works, it's very hard to pretend you didn't. And that's where this story really begins. After I noticed the strange transfers, I tried to ignore them for a while. That's what normal people do, right? You see something suspicious at work, and you assume someone higher up knows what they're doing. Or you convince yourself it's not your responsibility. But when your job is literally staring at transaction logs all day, curiosity becomes a habit. So I started quietly digging. Nothing dramatic at first. Just small checks during lunch breaks. I'd follow transaction chains the way some people follow rabbit holes on the internet. One payment to a vendor. That vendor forwarding funds to another account. Then another. Then another. By the end, the money looked perfectly clean. Like it had always belonged there. What bothered me wasn't just that it was happening, it was how easy it was. The system trusted numbers more than people. If the format looked correct, if the paperwork existed somewhere in the database, the transfer went through without anyone asking questions. And I realized something that should have scared me more than it did. If someone else could do it, then technically, so could I. I wish I could say the thought passed through my mind once and disappeared. It didn't. It stayed. For weeks after that realization, I'd sit at my desk watching transactions scroll down the screen and think about how invisible everything looked. Thousands of numbers moving every hour. Salaries, vendor payments, refunds, internal transfers. To anyone outside the system, it looked complicated. To the people inside it, it was just routine. That's when the idea started turning from curiosity into possibility. At first I framed it like a theoretical exercise. Just a mental puzzle. If someone wanted to move money unnoticed, how would they do it? I began mapping it out in my head. Not for action, I told myself. Just to understand the system better. I studied approval thresholds, which transfers triggered reviews, which ones slipped through automatically. I paid attention to the amounts people ignored, too small to raise alarms, too normal to look suspicious. And slowly, a plan started forming. Not because I intended to use it. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. There's a strange moment before someone does something wrong. It doesn't feel dramatic. No thunder, no movie-style realization that you're about to ruin your life. It's quieter than that. For me, it happened on a boring Tuesday afternoon. I was reviewing routine payment batches when I noticed something small, a vendor account that hadn't been used in months. It still existed in the system, still technically valid, but nobody had touched it in ages. Old contract, forgotten department, the kind of thing companies never clean up. The moment I saw it, the thought came instantly. That could work. I remember staring at the screen for a long time after that. Not doing anything. Just thinking. If a small payment went there, nobody would question it. And if that money moved somewhere else afterward, it would blend in with thousands of other transfers. That was the first time the idea stopped being abstract. It became practical. And the scary part wasn't the plan itself. It was how calm I felt while thinking about it. Once the idea became practical, my brain refused to let it go. I didn't suddenly jump into action. Instead, I did what I always did at work: I analyzed. For a couple of weeks, I treated the whole thing like a quiet research project. No notes on paper, no files on my computer. Just observation. I watched how payments moved through the system and how approvals worked. Most transactions passed automatically unless they crossed certain limits. Those limits became important. If a payment stayed below a specific threshold, the system didn't require a second pair of eyes. It simply processed the transfer and logged it as routine. I also paid attention to timing. Fridays were chaotic. End-of-month periods were worse. Hundreds of payments were pushed through at once, and the accounting team barely had time to breathe. If anything unusual slipped through during those hours, it would likely disappear into the noise. The strange part is that the more I studied it, the less risky it seemed. And that realization made the next step feel almost inevitable. Planning something like this doesn't feel like planning a crime. Not at first. It feels more like solving a puzzle with pieces nobody else is looking at. I didn't touch any money yet. That would have been reckless. Instead, I focused on the groundwork. The unused vendor account I'd noticed earlier became the center of everything. On paper, it still belonged to a small consulting contractor the company had worked with years ago. The contract had ended, but the account remained active in the system, just another forgotten entry in a long list of vendors. What I needed was a path. Money couldn't simply sit there. It had to move somewhere else, somewhere that wouldn't lead back to me. I spent nights researching how people moved funds through layers of accounts and small transfers. The goal wasn't speed, it was invisibility. Slow movement. Small amounts. Nothing dramatic enough to attract attention. By the time I finished mapping the process in my head, the whole thing felt disturbingly simple. And that simplicity made it far more dangerous. The day I actually did it didn't feel historic or life-changing. It felt ordinary. That's the unsettling part. It was a Friday afternoon near the end of the month, exactly the kind of chaotic window I had been watching for weeks. Payments were being processed constantly. The accounting team was rushing to clear invoices before the reporting deadline. Perfect noise. My hands were steady, but I remember my heart beating harder than usual. Not panic. More like adrenaline. The kind you get before doing something you know you shouldn't. The transfer itself was small. Almost laughably small compared to the company's usual payments. It looked like a delayed invoice tied to that old vendor account I had been studying. A few clicks. A confirmation prompt. Another click. And just like that, the payment entered the system queue with hundreds of others. No alarms. No suspicious messages. Nothing dramatic happened. The screen simply refreshed, showing the transaction as processed. That was the exact moment I crossed the line, not in theory anymore, but in reality. The strange thing about doing something wrong is that you expect the world to react immediately. I remember sitting there after the transfer went through, almost waiting for something to happen. A notification. A phone call. Someone walking over to my desk asking questions. Nothing came. The office sounded exactly the same as it had 5 minutes earlier. Keyboards clicking, someone laughing near the coffee machine, printers humming in the background. My screen kept refreshing with new transactions like nothing unusual had occurred. That silence was almost more unsettling than panic would have been. For the next hour I barely focused on my actual work. My eyes kept drifting back to the transaction log. I watched the payment move through the system stages: processing, verification, completion. Each step looked perfectly normal. By the time I left the office that evening, the money had already settled in the vendor account. That should have been the moment I stopped. Instead, it became proof of something dangerous. The system really didn't notice. Once the first transfer settled without anyone noticing, the fear started fading. That was the dangerous shift. The anxiety that had kept me cautious slowly turned into something else: confidence. The money sitting in the vendor account was useless if it stayed there. That account was still technically part of the company's system. If anyone reviewed it carefully, the payment could eventually raise questions. So the next step was to move it. I waited 3 days. That delay was intentional. Immediate transfers look suspicious in financial systems, but normal business activity often has gaps. Vendors receive payments, process them, and then send funds somewhere else days later. I created a second transaction, smaller, disguised as a subcontractor payment. When I pressed confirm this time, my heart didn't race the way it had before. I already knew the system would accept it. The process felt smoother, almost routine. Watching the money leave the vendor account felt different. Not just relief. It felt like momentum. By the time the second transfer cleared, something in my mindset had already shifted. The first time felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. The second felt like taking a careful step forward. Nothing collapsed beneath me. Days passed. Nobody asked questions. No internal audits appeared. The transaction logs kept filling with thousands of normal payments, and mine were just a few more lines among them. So I did it again. Not immediately. I forced myself to wait between transfers. A week sometimes. Sometimes 2. Each payment stayed small, always below the thresholds that triggered review. At work, nothing changed on the surface. I still drank the same terrible office coffee, complained about spreadsheets, and nodded through boring meetings. But privately, I was watching a quiet pattern form. Little streams of money moving exactly where I wanted them to go. The terrifying part wasn't the risk anymore. It was how quickly it started feeling normal. And when something illegal starts to feel routine, that's usually when the real problems begin. For almost 2 months, everything went exactly the way I had planned. Transfers were small, spaced out, and buried in the chaos of normal company payments. Every time I checked the logs, the transactions looked perfectly ordinary. That's why the email caught me off guard. It wasn't even directed at me specifically. It was sent to the entire finance department, a routine message from our internal audit team. They were planning a random review of vendor accounts over the next few weeks. Random. I must have read that email 5 times. My stomach dropped in a way it hadn't since the day of the first transfer. Up until that moment, the risk had felt theoretical. Now there was a real possibility that someone would start looking at accounts, including the one I had been using. All afternoon I tried to act normal, but my focus was gone. Every notification made my heart jump. For the first time since I started this, I realized something simple. I might not be as invisible as I thought. That night I barely slept. Every scenario kept replaying in my head. What if the auditors chose that vendor account? What if someone followed the transaction trail? The calm confidence I'd built over the past 2 months evaporated in a matter of hours. The next morning I went to work earlier than usual. My goal wasn't to move more money. That would have been reckless. Instead, I focused on making the existing transactions look less suspicious. I reviewed the descriptions attached to each payment and adjusted some of the documentation in the internal system. Small things that made the transfers look like legitimate consulting expenses. Nothing dramatic. Just paperwork. The kind companies generate every day. While doing that, I noticed something I hadn't expected. There were already dozens of messy records tied to that same vendor from years before. Old notes, inconsistent payment labels, partial documentation. In other words, the account was already chaotic. That discovery calmed me more than it should have. Because in a messy system, one more confusing detail rarely stands out. A week passed after the audit email, and every day felt longer than the last. I kept expecting someone from the audit team to stop by my desk or send a message asking for clarification about a transaction. Then, one afternoon, it happened. Not exactly the way I imagined, though. Mark from internal audit walked into our department and started chatting with people casually. Mark was the kind of guy who always looked relaxed, friendly smile, coffee mug in hand, like he was just visiting instead of reviewing financial records. Eventually, he stopped near my desk. "Hey, William," he said, scrolling through something on his tablet. "Quick question about some older vendor accounts. Do you know if the consulting contract with Westbridge Solutions ever officially closed?" For a second, my brain froze. That was the account. I forced myself to stay calm and lean back in my chair like I was thinking about it. "I'm not sure," I said. "I think it just faded out when that department reorganized." Mark nodded slowly. Then he thanked me and walked away. But the way he paused before leaving stayed with me all day. After that conversation with Mark, everything felt different. Before, the risk had always been distant, something abstract, something that might happen someday. Now it felt close enough to breathe on my neck. For the next week, I lived in a strange kind of tension. Every morning when I walked into the office, I half expected security to be waiting or HR asking me to step into a conference room. Every email notification made my chest tighten for a second before I opened it. But days kept passing. No meeting requests. No accusations. No sudden investigations. At one point I even checked the vendor account again, just to see if anyone had flagged it. The records looked untouched. All the transactions were still sitting there in the system exactly as I had left them. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made me realize something uncomfortable. The biggest danger might not be getting caught quickly. Sometimes the system just keeps running, while the consequences quietly build in the background. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. The audit passed through our department, and eventually moved on to other areas. Weeks turned into months, and the questions about that vendor account never came back. No investigation, no accusations, no security escort out of the building. On paper, I got away with it. The money had already moved through the layers I'd set up and was long gone from anything connected to the company. From the outside, everything looked normal. But the strange part is that getting away with it didn't feel like a victory. For a while, I kept expecting the knock on the door, the delayed consequence. Even when it never came, something had already changed in the way I looked at myself. I had crossed the line and discovered how easy it was. And that's the part one think people underestimate. Systems fail. Companies overlook things. Numbers move quietly in the background. But once you prove to yourself that you're capable of doing something like that, you can't completely forget it. If there's any lesson here, it's simple. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.